Good morning. I'm Trish Beth, and I'm the Communication and Program Specialist with the Northern Virginia Soil and Water Conservation District. Thank you all for coming on this beautiful Saturday morning. I want to introduce our speaker, Sam Droege. Sam is a wildlife biologist with the USGS, the US Geological Survey. He's at the Eastern Ecological Science Center in Laurel, Maryland. And most of us think of him as the native bee guy, the native bee expert. But his list of expertise is actually way too long to get into this morning. I looked up some facts on the website and found that he also coordinated the North American Breeding Bird Survey Program, developed the North American Amphibian Monitoring Program, BioBlitz, Cricket Crawl, Frog Watch USA, so much more than bees. But as you can hear, he's a very busy man, and we are very grateful that he joins us this morning to talk about bees. So, Sam, I will turn it over to you. Thank you very much for presenting.
Thank you for that introduction. Yeah, since I was a kid, I have basically done nothing but natural history. You know, waste of time for most people, but that's my life. So let me share, and we'll get into the talk. And thank you for, I was talking with Jim beforehand, and gosh, am I sharing? Oh, there we go. Sorry, I'm trying to do two things at once. So let's make this full here. And I thought this was on already. There we go. Okay. So I'm really happy to talk to foresters and forestry related people, because I think it's an acknowledged and appreciated part of the pollinator puzzle. Let's talk about the context here. So if you dial out from Virginia and you look at North America, what you see is that the Eastern North American deciduous temperate forest climate and trees are pretty much only in the East, right? You don't really get into the West. You get things that are dominated by conifers, and the deciduous trees are different and not nearly as diverse. And then when you look at the plants within the East, you realize that what we're looking at is a very long-term endemic, and again, largely unappreciated, because we all live here, so we tend to dismiss what we know. But we're in a very unique ecosystem. Okay, so it's filled, if you think of the East, it's filled with endemics. So there are many, many, many species of plants, but also many, many species of bees, because of this bee-plant interaction that we're going to talk about, that are endemic only to the Eastern United States. And when you think about land use and what would have been natural or native, again, you dial different things different ways. Right now, we live in a human-dominated environment with some treescapes within that environment. You go into the mountains, you get more. You go into some of the lowlands, and you can get into some big systems, but very much crafted by the past land use history of an area. But you go back even further, and as you go back further, two things happen. One is that you shift just culturally. You shift from a let's call them colonist-dominated landscape and the things that they would do, to a Native American-dominated landscapes and the things that they did. They also had huge impacts, right? They burned everything. That was their big tool. That was the bulldozer of the era. That was the steel-tipped hoe, and the kinds of things that they had access to. So they were very intelligent and very thoughtful in places they burned, places they didn't burn. And there were gradients around places, particularly in the later half of the time period that Indians were in the East, when they started using more and more agriculture, creating more and more settlements. You had actually quite a large impact of land clearing. They did the kind of, what was it called, where you would burn an environment periodically, plant it for a while, and then move on. And that became a rotating open openness to the environment, and then hunting and uh, the kinds of landscapes they wanted to see for hunting, or hunting itself, big circular fires, those sorts of things in the next uh, landscape out away from the villages also had huge impacts. So if we then, and then also the other thing going on, glaciers, right? So if we go back only about 10 to 15,000 years ago, which is almost nothing, there were glaciers in Pennsylvania. The area down here was very different. We're talking spruce, fir, taiga, and something that might be tundra-esque. It's hard to say about the tundra kind of thing, but certainly we had all kinds of spruce and other things, and a lot of the deciduous forests were pushed much further south. So I think the point I'm making here in general is that our landscape it's nothing new, that this landscape has undergone big changes over time. Like, we think of our influence on our landscapes as some novel new thing, and before that it was pristine, and nature was just taking its course. And the answer is no. You both had an environmental gradient of climate change, the glaciers, as a huge part. And ever since the last period of glaciation, you had a very active Indian and often large Indian population that was also manipulating the environment. And a lot of that manipulation led to opening up the woodlands, clearing out the understory, creating small savannas. So think of areas like on the Eastern Shore. Some of that would have been very open, and also on some of the interior drier valleys. So we have the Susquehanna, that area coming down from the north, dumping the Chesapeake Bay. That was mostly open landscape. Open meaning not exactly like prairies of the West, but a brushy prairie open environment that kept open by burns. And then you got down on the Monocacy and Maryland, and then that became the Shenandoah Valley as you went. So I just trying to give you a portrait that this wasn't always a treed environment, and that we are seeing changes that are large, and we've continued to see that, and that has gone on in the past. But if we removed all the humans from the environment right now, almost the entire region would be forested, okay? Because fire would have been the thing that would have prevented an area from being forested. And fire is very rare. Natural fire is very rare because it would have to be lightning induced. And when you get lightning, you're getting it in the summer, and that's our wet time of year. So you can get small fires, and you can see this, it's tracked online. The acreage of natural fires are kept as a separate category, and it's like fractions of an acre. So most of the environment would move in that direction. So together we have this very unique deciduous forest, pine forest, many endemic plant species environment, and an environment in which open parts of that landscape have moved in from the prairie and the south, as culturally people have kept it open for the past 20,000 years. So we still look at that and talk about what is original and what should we be moving towards. And the answer is probably both now. Okay, is we have had a long history, 10,000 years of having open landscapes with all kinds of uncommon plants in there. So we don't want to plant trees back on everything. And at the same time, we look at what's special about the area. And it's not actually those plants and the animals associated with them that have moved in. It's the forest. So when we look at the forest, we see we have, from now we're moved to a plant-bee relationship kind of thing. So another aspect of trees that is underappreciated is that they are really good at the third dimension. So the X and the Y that's sort of your prairie kind of landscape, the landscape of the pollinator garden, pollinator meadows, which is what the emphasis has been if you look at just online, let's say. But the Z, the aspect of going above ground, that's where you get trees and shrubs and subcanopies and things like that, really creating huge amounts of pollen and nectar. And we're talking, in comparison to say, the kinds of things you would see on the ground, monster amounts of pollen and nectar. And that's why honeybee people really, they know this. They know that they're going to get most of their pollen and nectar during the spring. And that time period is when most of the bloom, most of the pollen and nectar, if you just look at the volume of pollen and nectar per acre, is occurring, most of that coming from trees. And we'll talk about some of the details here in a minute. And I don't want to actually give my entire lecture extemporaneously at this point. But the important thing to just keep in mind is that forests are a special and key and not thought a lot about component. And we want to think, I would say, think more heavily about that as a place where the conservation of bees also needs to occur or be acknowledged instead of just like putting trees on the ground. You guys are not doing just the, like, let's just plant as many acres as possible sort of approach to forestry, but I would suggest that bringing in more thinking about what are the parts of the forest that are adding to and supporting rather than just simply attracting bees. So let's move off of this, and we will bring these topics back up. Okay, so if another large picture thing here is that when we talk about saving bees, it's less about some of the details that people might be thinking about, which is necessarily pesticides or some of these other things like not enough nesting opportunities and those kinds of things. Basically, native flowering plants. So we're going to set aside the conversation about native versus non-native plants and the relative roles and the relative importance, just to say that while certain kinds of non-native plants do attract bees, in the same manner, putting out a bird feeder attracts birds. So both those situations you have more birds and you have more bees in an area, but they're not the bees and the birds that we're most interested in that are doing most of the my program likes me to keep going. That is providing the conservation help that you want. So more bees, attracting bees is not necessarily the endpoint. Attracting and supporting the bees that are in most need of support, which are bee species associated with native flowering plants. And we'll talk about this too a little bit, which is basically many of our native bees are basically picky. They're specialists, we would call them, on only a certain few kinds of plants. In a couple cases, it's trees too. In many cases, it's shrubs. More cases, it would be shrubs and perennials. Okay, just some context here. So shade and open plants, as we talked about, that's sort of the proper mix to think about in terms of large regional scales. If we're talking regional management of bee populations and what's important, there'll be both that in there for many different reasons. And the most important bee populations are retained in natural areas that retain most of their biodiversity. Again, this link, number of kinds and proper kinds of native plants equals a highly diverse bee population. And you don't have to know necessarily a lot of details. A lot of details are interesting. And also, as an aside, you can email me and I can send you our draft Bees of Maryland and District of Columbia manuscript that has, for each of the 450 species in Maryland, has management and conservation recommendations for those as far as we can go. So as goes Maryland, so goes Virginia in lots of ways. About 400 species of native bees in Virginia. So when you have that many, they have to be doing something different, right? They can't all be competing with each other. And they do. They divide the environment up into many different subsections. And we'll talk a little bit about that. The details are overwhelming for this particular talk. And we won't go into too many details, just some little examples. Prince George's County, where I work and live, no surprise, has the most in Maryland, 306 species known. The refuge that I work on, 200 species. DC, 227 species. When we ask about urban areas, what's in there, there's roughly 50 species of bees that are pretty tolerant of urban environments. So think birds, which you probably know more, and plants too, there are some kinds of birds that, like blue jays and white-throated sparrows and song sparrows and gray catbirds, that can tolerate urban, suburban, highly altered, man-made environments, and many others like scarlet tanagers, cerulean warblers, and flamingos, and most of the waterfowl that are like, no, our needs are not met. So we can change some of that by, in the case of bees, by building the proper flower base for those bees within the city environment. So we do see some of these rare bees inside cities when you have the proper kinds of plants planted. So just a little bit about bees. We don't have time to get into a lot of details, but some things need to be mentioned. So most people have lots of information in their minds about honeybees. Every single person in the United States knows this insect, right? So there is a lot of embedded information in there. And the shortcut is none of the things that you have embedded about honeybees apply to the native species. So we can't talk about hives, we can't talk about swarms, we can't talk about barbed stingers, we can't talk about allergic reactions. All that stuff doesn't apply. Most of our native species are solitary and much more specialized and live for only a fraction of a year in terms of flying around time. So our native species, roughly US 4,000. So again, a lot of species of bees. Mostly they're western and desert species. California 2,000, Texas 1,000. East of the Mississippi 800. Notice that's much less. And then we saw some of these other results. In contrast, the entire United Kingdom, which is many times larger than Prince George's County, has only 250 species. It's also further north. Okay, so now let's talk about bees in woodland context. So basically, with exceptions, bees are using the woods only in the spring. So for a couple reasons. One, when you think about, okay, when do trees bloom? When do they have pollen and nectar? It's the spring, right? So the last tree species is probably was probably the chestnut, which was early June. And everything else is earlier than that. And again, the honeybee people really track this quite well. And then after that, we can go, and we've done this, into a lot of the heavily canopied woods of the east. There's exceptions on the eastern shore in some of the very, very dry areas that have a bit of an understory because the canopy is just not completely closed. But for practical purposes, there's nothing going on in a woods after that. But additionally, on top of the things that are going on up there in the canopy, the tree things, you have an entire understory that is created and endemic to the east because of that deciduous overstory and the relatively moist conditions that occur in the eastern United States and Canada, where you have all that vernal bloom. So you have all the spring bloom, trilliums, trout lilies, we can go on and on, spring beauties, Virginia bluebells, all kinds of things are occurring in the understory. Many are small and obscure that bloom before the canopy comes out, and then they disappear also. Those two have a huge number of bees, amounting to the densest bee populations occur in bottomland forests, where you have a carpet of bloom in the understory the entire year. So these are hugely important areas for bees. Yet when people want to do something, they mostly are planting a meadow, which is good. And there's important things to keep in mind when you are doing a meadow, but we're talking about forests and what can be done in forests and those kinds of things. So in the tree land, going back upstairs to the trees, so we're not going to talk about the vernal understory that much, but it is something to keep in mind in your management strategies. How can we bring back some of the component if you're moving from a landscape that has been, as many have been grazed or plowed in the past, bringing back these plants that don't like to move very quickly, the trilliums, the trout lilies, and things like that, and getting that back together, if that's the appropriate landscape for them. Because some areas like the Eastern Shore largely is vacant because too acidic, of the sweet-soiled, vernal, lush spring flower landscapes of the understory that we have from Piedmont West, and it's replaced with like an ericaceous. I'm going to talk about this in the future, but basically like your huckleberries and blueberries and mountain laurels. So now, when we're talking about trees again, we have wind pollinated, bug pollinated, and mixed approaches to their pollination. And of course, if you're wind pollinated, the value to insects and bees in particular, well, the value to bees in terms of using that pollen is very low. And the reason is that the pollen is designed to float around in a insect pollinated system. The plant would wrap that pollen and fill that pollen with all sorts of fats, lipids, and proteins. In a wind-pollinated system, basically they have what is required for that pollen to sprout on the stigma and, create a pollen tube. And that's it. So it turns out that the value of a wind-pollinated chunk of pollen to a bee is relatively low. Sometimes that may be it, the dominant thing going on, and we can see, for example, oaks having some attraction to bees, but not an awful lot. I've seen some papers on this, mostly from Asian studies, and I bring that up because the sawtooth oak, which is a species that I think is still for sale in Maryland by the state, has bees on it. I've gone by sawtooth oak trees, not realizing what they were on a management area or something, and hearing bees on them and realizing that it was being used quite a bit. But our native species seem to be only used periodically. It's never a dominant part of the pollen loads. And so the rest of these species you see here are really not used by bees because they don't have the nutrient qualities that are required for properly raising baby bees, which would be the pollen fat aspect plus the nectar. So the nectar is providing carbohydrates. None of that's available. So then we have an entire series of trees that are producing the proper mix of nutrient requirements that will result in a baby bee. The first one I put here is magnolia, which is somewhat of an exception. It is bug pollinated, but it's pollinated by beetles. And according to some, this is the originator of the I will have bugs move my pollen around strategy by trees. It was the first tree group to do that. I don't know if that's still the case. And you can see several of these other species. It makes sense if you're a honeybee person, those are all your go-to spring pollen pulses or nectar pulses that you see show up in your honey production in there. And then there are many, many other species that provide this, but this gives you some sort of context that there are a number of different tree species, each of which its own proclivities on how it grows, where it lives. And most of the time, those are what we call open access trees, providing pollen and nectar to many, many different species. So as I mentioned, if you really want to categorize into just two groups, the forests, we have acidic forest where you have a pine, hickory, oak, tends to be drier sometimes, but the underlying soils are acidic. They tend to favor the ericaceous shrubs. And we have an entire community of bees that not only thrives on ericaceous shrub bloom, blueberries, huckleberries, and mountain laurels and azaleas, but actually specialize on them. So if you remove blueberries, for example, then you lose a whole entire set of species of bees that only go to blueberries. So here's another whole place where the forests are providing not only just some food for bees, but also plants and food that are so specific in terms of the nutrition requirements for some bees that without those plants, bees disappear. It's not like, oh, well, we'll just use dandelions or we'll move to another kind of tree species. So a lot of that understory is very important to certain groups of bees. And a thing to think about within a forestry management context is how do we promote that understory of these native ericaceous shrubs, not a bunch of bush honeysuckle and autumn olive, which do attract bees, but only a very limited number. And so they're honeybees being an exception, but they also have bumblebees and carpenter bees, which are generalists. So I'm not going to get distracted by that. And then we have the sweeter soil. So you see here trout lilies and uvularia, which are bellworts, I guess. And they have bees that only go to those particular species. You see them in bottomlands. You see them in the sweeter woods, the limestone-based soils of the West. You see those occurring upslope quite a bit. One problem is that many of the best spots for these kinds of vernal plants are bottomlands, and everywhere we now have a lesser celandine problem. So what is that? Ranunculus? Is it ranunculus? Ficaria? I can't recall the scientific name. It's a huge problem in the DC area. I've seen it down in Richmond. I'm sure it's in many, many other communities. And it essentially will completely take over and become a uniform environment. And we've done some studies and we see literally 1/10 the number of bee captures occurring in areas taken over by the lesser celandine compared to native plant populations. So a big problem, an ongoing one of the many different kinds of problems that we have. And then some species of trees have a mixed approach where it's both wind and seems to have components of wind and also components of insect pollinating. So many of the maples are that way. So from a bee point of view, red maple, for example, is a very important, very early spring source of pollen and nectar for bee species. It's one of the first species of tree or any plant to bloom, and many bees will come out when it's warm enough and harvest some of that pollen and nectar from maples. And then when it becomes cold, they go back into their holes, which are inevitably in the ground, and wait until another pulse of early spring, warm enough, meaning more than 50 degrees weather for them. At the end, then chestnut is bracketing the other end of the spectrum, where it has a mixed approach, but it's at the June end of the cycle of bloom in forests. Persimmon I know less about. It's something I want to learn about, but this is what I understand. And the reason it's not that I don't see a lot of persimmon, but the problem is persimmon and trees in general they're very tall, and I'm down on the ground, and I am seeing what's going on up in the canopy is very difficult for me and for other people. And so a lot of times our understanding of the importance of these trees is minimal. In spring, we at least can see a lot of activity on maples. And with chestnut, we're just aware of that because of the kinds of studies that are going on. But a lot of times we tend to dismiss these tree pollinating, particularly the tall trees, just simply because we can't see what's going on up there. So we have a relatively weak understanding of what the list of species are that are up in those areas. And so there's lots of need for more study of the impact of these forests and the volume of pollen and nectar that they're producing on establishing and providing for bee populations within a region. So there is one group that we know more about, largely because they're either on the crop end of the spectrum. So orchards are filled with rosaceous plants. So we look at pears, cherries, apples, I think peaches. I'm not sure about that, but quite a few blackberries, the brambles, and there are others that kind of fall into that category of what we call party plants, hollies, and they tend to be shorter statured, so we can look at them and we can observe them. And also because they're crop plants, we also are concerned and study their pollination ecology. And more people are looking at, well, what native species are interacting in these orchards with these plants, and how much can we count on the native species if honeybees become, say, unavailable for pollination in the future. And depends on the plant, really. But in many cases, apples are a good example that you don't need. In the East, you don't need honeybees because the native species are both super efficient and super available. Great big source of pollen and nectar. Everyone in the neighborhood goes and uses an apple orchard for gathering pollen and nectar, because why wouldn't you? So when we think about these party plants, we call them party plants because the tree and or the bramble or the plant, their strategy for getting pollinated is not to do what many other plants do, which is restrict access to all this very expensive for the plant to produce nectar and pollen to as few species of animals as possible, so that you don't have a bunch of party crashers who are coming in, stealing all the pollen and nectar, eating it, and then not creating they're not pollinating the plant in the end. The opposite thing is going on with the party plant. So instead of adding poison, so what a plant can do is make weird blooms. So you can have a very long corolla, you can have bends, you can make it tight so only certain kinds of bees can come in. Just look at flowers and you'll see examples of, like, why is that flower that shape? And why does it bloom only in the morning or in the evening? And the answer really has to do with restricting access of the pollen and nectar stored in that bloom to only its favorite pollinators, which are tied to the sizes, shapes, and timing of bloom of that particular plant. So here they open up. A child would draw these flowers. This very simple platform, all the stamens and pollen and nectar are basically like pooling there, ready to be grabbed. And every bee and wasp and other things and butterflies just moves in and grabs as much as they want, and pollination happens. So you would think this is the normal approach, but actually it's not. Many other plants are doing all that they can to not have that happen, but these don't. And so let's see if I have anything else to cover here. So when we look at the species of spring bees, we see that most of the bees that are in a tree context that are working on these trees are not specialist bees. In other words, they are grabbing pollen and nectar from a bunch of different sources, and that many of the plants that are tall, so the taller the tree, with, again, just a couple exceptions, are going to be trees that don't have specialist bees. In other words, if a tree doesn't have a specialist bee, then that means that the tree is providing pollen and nectar largely to whoever wants to come. And if a plant has specialists, then what you find is all sorts of interesting chemical alterations to their pollen and nectar and other strategies to restrict the number of species of insects that come into that flower. So this is not the case for most. As you go up in height, mostly trees are like, yeah, anyone can come here. And when we look at the bees, many of the very common species of bees in woodlands are these species that are accessing the pollen and nectar from these party plants. Also, another pattern is among these, just think apples or the things you might know from being at home in orchards, the amount of time that that tree is in bloom can be relatively short. So week and a half, most things are done. And that's not enough time for a single bee species to grab all the pollen and nectar it needs. And when you think about that, what you see is a need for a complex environment where you have many of these party plants, i.e. different kinds of cherries, different kinds of rose bushes, all kinds of things, hollies, they're all blooming at slightly different times. Now, their individual bloom period is relatively short, but if you kind of plot that out, you'll see that there's largely bloom like that in a woods from very consistently from very early in the spring right through to the full-on canopy closure in May. And that probably has happened naturally over time as all these different plant species they balance when they bloom with the amount of bees that are available. So the bees get a consistent pattern of pollen and nectar over time, and the plants get pollination, which is what their goal is. And when we look at what should we be planting, this is a call to actually be planting lots and lots of different kinds of things to recreate that. So you don't have just one set of plants that blooms for this small period of time, a week and a half, and then the bees are essentially left high and dry, although I'm sure they will just fly until they find something else. But in the best of all worlds, you have a complexity of pollen and nectar sources from these woody plants. Okay, so here's some examples of some of the party plant species. I would just point out that hawthorn is a really good bee plant. I've seen it in plantings. There's a few species that are commercially available as landscape trees, and they are just covered in bees. But more and more, that species, which tends to be a successional species, is just disappearing from our landscapes. Anyway, I'm a fan of hawthorns. So another thing to think about is because we live in this, particularly right now, we live in an environment that is trees and not trees. And so some of the not trees might be the edge, which would be natural, would be like the edge of a river, the edge of a marsh, that kind of thing. But most of the edges are, I put a road in, I've got my driveway, I am carving a square out of this environment so I can put in playing fields. And what that means is a couple things. One is you break the canopy of the forest. Okay, so now light from one side at least is coming in, and the plants are going to respond. And they're going to put up a wall of green to close that area off, because why wouldn't you? Here's a bunch of free energy that's important for the plant. And many, many invasive species use that environment, and they're going to, and a lot of them are moved around by birds, which also use that environment because that's where a lot of productivity occurs. And when we look at particularly the understory forest, woody plants, so the shrubby stuff and the subcanopy stuff. So for example, you can go into the interior of many forests and you'll see a bunch of blueberry bushes, high bush blueberry in particular, but also carpets of huckleberry, and you'll see mountain laurel in lots of places. And they might bloom, but the pollination is very low. So there's very little seed set going on in there. And a lot of times they don't even bother to bloom. So basically they're just hunkering down. They're not getting that much light. They're getting just enough to subsist, but not enough to pump out a bunch of pollen and nectar and go into seed production mode, which is, again, an expensive part of a plant's lifestyle. They're waiting for a mastodon to come in and crack down a bunch of trees, or a hurricane or a fire to open that environment up and allow a lot of sun to come in, and then they produce their pollen and nectar in spades, and they produce fruit, and the cycle continues. Or now we create that by doing forestry. We create that by simply hacking through forests with our roadways. And so it's an opportunity for us to augment a lot of the important forest understory species by focusing not so much on the understory in the middle of the woods, where again they're having a pretty tough time pulling off any real contribution, because it is a struggle to be in there. but along these edges where there are light breaks. So, and also we get to view them more often if we see, and who doesn't want to see a bunch of native azaleas and lining the edges of wood. So I think, again, not a place we think an awful lot about, but if we look at where our opportunities to produce more bees are within a forested environment, a lot of times it's the edge, not with planting herbaceous, let's call them meadow plants in those environments, away from the edge, yes, but at the edge, those are the perfect kinds of places to bring in those ericaceous shrubs, to bring in a variety of rosaceous plants and hollies. Sometimes they come in on their own. Really the key is maybe some planting, but a lot of times it's the management of invasive species that come with, particularly in the DC, Baltimore. Well, I'm using that Maryland axis. So let's say the Richmond, Northern Virginia kinds of environments where you have just a huge amount of propagule sourcing in those areas, and they're in the understory. So any disturbance releases all this invasive plant. So you have a much higher probability of getting a nice invasive edge in those areas than, say, way out in the mountains or on the eastern shore. So so control is good. Blackberries, huckleberries, blueberries are big components that are sometimes just are there. And you just want to encourage them by periodic trimming back of the invasives. Another underrepresented area that really falls into a forest category is scrub. So scrub environments can be just a transitional thing, and usually are, right? They are an environment that is created by, say, forestry practices or fire, or simply we put in a new road and the succession alongside that road is moving in. And those create often, and power lines are sort of a permanent scrub habitat, or can be, unless, sometimes they're just herbicided and mowed to death. But those are environments that have a set of plants like blackberries, and sumac is an underappreciated one. Lyonia, which is the maleberry and staggerbush group, very underappreciated plants that have these specialist bees that also aren't going to really, like sumac in particular, does not occur in the interiors of forest, as neither does blackberry. Or if they do, they're either repressed or in very very dry and depauperate woods to begin with. So again, another environment that tends to be neglected as a pollinator environment, of which we can or do create lots of that type of environment and then tend to ignore. But it's another place to think about manipulating, removing trees, if that's appropriate, certainly under power lines it is, not herbiciding everything back, favoring the native plants through selective herbiciding or selective cutting can create beautiful, beautiful meadows in a way of scrubby environment that can be filled with all kinds of uncommon and rare bee species. And that's part of our problem. Over time, we have a tendency as people to make everything neat and tidy and to dumb down everything to just a few kind of components of acceptable shaped plants that look good to us from our, using our suburban mentality, whereas a scrubby environment looks junky. And yet it is one of the places that I always go to when I'm doing bee surveys in a region. I'm looking for that power line with a really good understory of scrub rather than something that looks like a golf course. Okay, so manage your edges for biodiversity. I had a set of another slide here, but I trimmed it out and left that one in, so apologies for that. So when we think about pollinators, and we think about managing for pollinators, a lot of times what we think about is planting stuff. Like, okay, we need to go and plant a pollinator meadow, or we need to, dig this up and plant that. Well, that's a huge amount of work. And if you think about the number of acres that are impacted, can be impacted and are realistic to impact over time, it's not going to be planting because it's just too expensive and time consuming. And a lot of times it's a losing proposition because you're also basically planting every single seed that's in that soil column that's invasive that has just been waiting for some kind of disturbance to come in. Separate topic, but a place that has huge and immediate good proper consequences for supporting bees is stopping mowing. Okay, so we have just on your drive home or your drive anywhere today, just look at the number of places that are mown. And if you stopped mowing many of those places, particularly if they're adjacent to a woodland, or are even better, are places that are mown 2 or 3 times during the year, as many roadsides are. So that doesn't sound that bad. Well, we're not really mowing that much, but the reality is you have just mown down most of the fall several times, maybe twice, maybe just once, the fall crop of important pollinator plants. And the scrubby stuff doesn't have really a chance to produce bloom because it almost never produces bloom on the first year wood. So but if you stop and just do a yearly mow or a mow every 2 or 3 years, which can be just a strip of, one mower deck away from that road once a year, and then the rest can be much more maintained at a higher rate, you immediately are creating habitat and you're producing less pollution, you're saving gas, theoretically your mowing contract will get decreased. There's so many benefits to this, and it's not a big long-term project. It's just a cultural shift in where things are mown. So it's so underappreciated as that's your impact is where can I not mow? I don't have to go in there and plant stuff. You could do all kinds of manipulations that would probably be good because particularly if it's highly mown, it's going to be mostly grasses initially. But over time, with a yearly mow, the right mix of native plants, hopefully, are going to move into those environments. So we're departing from our notion of we're talking bees and trees. So the perimeter of the field once a year in winter, we mowed that, mow out your ditches once a year in winter. A lot of this is just mowing stuff, brush hog, those transmission lines every other year in winter. So you develop the scrub. When we look at specialist bees, we have a list of that. I can send this to you if you can't grab this in time. You can look up Fowler and Droege to find it, and you'll see that what we have is mostly shrubs, which can be associated with woodlands, and understory plants in woodlands, and also many, many perennials out in the fields have bees that only go to a small subset. In some cases, is literally only one species of plant. Those are the species of bees that tend to be the ones that we're most concerned about, that we have a hard time refinding each year, that are most vulnerable to change, and thus the biodiversity aspect. On the other hand, the plants that are supporting them are generally not super uncommon. There's a couple of cases, but you really can't build a specialized system if the host plant winks out all the time because it's also rare. So these tend to be something that people can incorporate if they understand the plants. You don't necessarily need to know the bee component because it's technical, because a lot of these have to be identified under a microscope. And it's better to think about, okay, I don't understand the bee part of the equation, but the plant part of the equation I can deal with. And if you just give me an idea of the targets, with the specialized bee thing being the place to look for ideas, we can go with that. And then the other thing is always just your biodiversity of bloom. You want that range of plants bloom in the forest environments throughout the spring. So we talked about these kinds of things here, almost no trees, the exception being willow and chestnut. And willow is really kind of on the margins, right? Because it's really only black willow. The black willow becomes a tree. All the other willows are essentially something like, I would call them scrub or sub trees, low, very low growing trees, hardly, and certainly aren't in forests, and neither is black willow for that matter. They're all wetland associated or primarily wetland associated kinds of plants. They can be incorporated more into landscapes of urban and suburban environments without creating problems like the weeping willow. Many of those species are also supportive of the specialized bee community. There's 8 species at least in Maryland that only use willow trees. And then the other tree so all the other trees, none of them have specialist bees. The only exception is chestnut, and we'll talk about that in a second, which is an interesting story. So removing invasives, I think there are many reasons for everyone to do this, but some of it is just competition. With the native understory is too severe to support the natives. The other is deer control. Okay, here is a very, very old picture of one of the 2 species of chestnut weevil. So this species was thought to be extinct until recently because of the chestnut crisis. And then they refound it in an arboretum that had chestnut and chinkapin in it. So chinkapin being a castanea, which is the genus of American chestnut, carried over many of the bees and other insects that were highly specialized on chestnut. And there are a bunch of not only just weevils, look at that snout, like you would need something like that to get through all those spines, but also it's which is another reason to have backing up. It's not just to prevent mastodons and whatever else was eating these things, but it was also just to like keep away the weevils from injecting their eggs into the seed of the lovely large seed of your plant. So backing up, the chestnut also there's a distribution of chestnut right there in the east, right? It's really a super solid forest interior, mostly Appalachian, and a few outlying populations endemic to the region. And then here's the bloom. So people more in the past than now would say, well, this is a wind-pollinated species. But if you ever see this is chinkapin. If you ever see a chinkapin or backing up again, chinkapin is a lovely plant in itself and is a very worthy to plant species and thrives in these edge environments. It does get the disease, which I forget the name of, that chestnut gets, but they cycle so much faster that they still are around. But another worthy plant and largely supporting this fauna of chestnut that was lost when the American chestnut largely disappeared. But also these plants are covered in bees too. And it turns out a number of years ago when we were looking at some chinkapin trees, we found this bee that hadn't been seen in 80 years. And this is the species here, a lovely sort of semi-blue, glinty species of Andrena that we hadn't seen in 80 years. And then we were like, well, that's odd. And the one time we collect on chinkapin, here it is. Is there something going on with chinkapin? So we searched the literature, and then we started going to chestnut orchards, these backcross orchards that people have, and we started finding the species there. And so it was a very fun story of finding and recovering a specialist that had been hiding in plain sight, and was also something that we thought had maybe disappeared from the fauna of North America. So plant more chinkapin. Chestnut, maybe we're not quite ready yet. So I'll also point out we know relatively little, as I mentioned before, about the bees that are in the canopies and what's going on up there, because it's just a very difficult to study area. And so in summary, I guess I want to come back to several points that we made. First is that forest is the dominant ecotype of the region. So yes, there's a lot of these openings, and these openings are can be highly specialized. So some of these areas that have a very sandy environment have created really interesting prairie-like compositions, but forest is what the East is about. And forest has the endemism in it that are should be the targets of a lot of our larger thinking about preserving species in general in the eastern United States, both plants and insects. And if you take care of the plants, if you take care of the plants, the insects are going to come too. So we are now back in the game of losing forests, whereas in the past we didn't have that. Well, I should say we did have that in different, gosh, I shouldn't go into this, but you largely know the pattern. Colonists came, there was forest manipulated by the Indians. They then removed a lot of that forest because it was a wood-based economy. We reached this very low ebb in the 1800s. Then productivity and transportation from the Midwest allowed food production to shift from the East, and a lot of the land that was more marginal was abandoned, going back to forest, and now we're back to losing forest again, just from a urbanization component. And we're also chopping it up into small pieces. So, I also, I guess you guys know this a lot. You've seen these mitigation efforts where people will cut down a forest that had been there for millennia. In other words, it hadn't been something that came up from an old field or was just a bunch of young sweet gum, and then say, well, we planted an equal number of trees on this landing pad, and it doesn't work that way ecologically. I'm just really getting into a personal gripe there. And thinking again about replanting, moving a field into forest or other sorts of situations where you're going from a low diversity state, think about adding in a greater diversity of plants, particularly the vernal plants that have had a long time, that have a hard time moving around. In other words, these vernal plants largely aren't the kinds of things that have light, fluffy seeds. They're moved around by ants and things like that. They're used to being in an environment that is always trees with periodic disturbance, rather than I need to fly over to this one patch of trees. So active moving of a bunch of the understory components into new forests is something to think about when creating new forests, and to look at having those plants moved into urban and suburban environments, into newly created wooded environments, which may simply be, I planted a red maple in the middle of my quarter-acre lot, and now it's shading everything out. Well, there's plants that are like, we're good with that. Native plants and invasive control, and particularly more vernal plants. That is the end. I never can tell how long I have taken. I don't have a timer on here. This is contact information here. All of our pictures are public domain. The insect and the plant pictures can be pulled from our Flickr site and downloaded. You don't have to ask our permission, and you can do whatever you want with them. You can sell them. People do. And there's a little Bees of Maryland book out that you can pick up and take a look at and use for identification with a pair of butterfly binoculars when you're out in the field, if you're curious about bees. And I will stop there and see if we do have time for questions.
Thank you, Sam. That was a really fascinating perspective. And yes, we do have time for questions. People are, of course, welcome to drop off if they need to, but we have some questions in the chat. My personal favorite takeaways, because I live in the suburbs, are that the suburbs actually are edgy. I'm happy to hear that.
Yeah.
And further validation that I can stop mowing. Let me go through some of the questions that we had in the chat. From Marilyn says, Isabel Tree in her book Wilding suggests that herds of free-roaming animals created pasture woodland habitats prior to human manipulation of the environment. And her work is based in England, but it might apply anywhere. And what do you think of animal herds as early sources of creating open landscapes in addition to Native Americans and/or fire?
That is a really interesting question. So if you look at the environment prior to the glacial maximums 10,000 years ago, we had this megafauna, which is now missing. So we had beavers that were 4 times the size of our current beavers. We had mastodons, and which I think were the forest elephant, and then we had mammoths, which I think were grazers. So all of those would have, and so there are and giant sloths and things that would have been designed to work on the forest and to tear things out of trees and to manipulate that. So I think while the Indians became a component of forest disturbance, and then we also became a component of forest disturbance, introducing fire in spring and fall artificially and changing that environments, we did have large groups of very large animals, which I have only an incomplete understanding of the different species that would have been here that would have been adding a disturbance component, even if there were the absence of fire. So that's about as far as I can go with, insights into that.
There's a question from Stella. If you and Doug Tallamy got into an arm wrestling match, who would win? I'm kidding. She basically says a lot of us in the native plant world base our designs and our plans for our yards on Doug Tallamy. And he has a list of keystone species that support butterflies and moths. So if you look at the world from a bee's point of view, does that change that list?
Sure. Well, actually, I know Doug well, and we have chatted many times over the past number of years. And so the way to think about it is that Doug sees the world through a caterpillar lens. I see the world through a bee lens. And if we brought in other people, which we should, but we don't have time to do, we would look through the leaf miner lens, the tree hopper lens, the wood borer lens, and the soil lens, and all these things. And we see that the pattern in general is each native plant or native plant group, depending on how you define these things taxonomically, has a set of species of insects, and then sometimes also viruses and fungi and a variety of other small micro creatures in the soil that are only associated with that particular plant or plant group. So when we are inviting the native plant species back into our environments, which, recall, if you dial your property back far enough, it was all native plants at one point. And we won't go into the cultural maintenance of lawns and things, but you're just inviting back the original inhabitants. You can repatriate this community and help it out, because those insect groups, unlike, say, the bison and the elk and other species and wolves that were here, they're not coming back to your backyard. But these smaller individuals, these smaller people, they're mobile. So bees are great dispersers. We have a number of studies of these things. So you build it, they will come, is the answer. And when we look at keystone species, so I haven't really gone down that path very far, so I don't have big thoughts on what the keystone species are, unlike Doug. Doug has spent a lot of time working on that. But if we look at Doug's list and my list, there's lots of overlap. So his oak list, which tends to be very high on his Keystonian thing, is relatively low on mine. Bees every once in a while will use oak pollen. But if we think about oaks in another way, we see that oaks create a space in which other plants thrive. And so in a less direct way, oaks then are a keystone for bees. So I don't worry too much about the arm wrestling aspects of things. It's very compatible. And it's just remember the fable about the blind people touching the elephant, right? We each have a different sense of the environment based on what we see. So I'm seeing it from this bee point of view. So the key and the simple thing is, don't worry about the details. Don't worry about, like, oh, well, I can't do about the caterpillars because the bee thing. it's all the kind of thing you want to integrate together and invite as many as appropriate different community members back into the environment that were in your landscape, your regional landscape, before it became houses. So a lot of the approach to think about is go for walks, go to look at some of the landscapes that are still largely in a natural state and look at what plants are doing well. Those plants doing well there are probably going to do well in your environment. And rather than bringing in Queen of the Prairie, which is a really beautiful plant that had a toehold in the region, look more at, well, should I plant chinkapin, or should I be planting some of the other kinds of cool things like Leonia bushes and stuff like that. I'll get off my soapbox now.
Dale wants to know if it's just native chestnuts that are good for native bees, or if they also use the Chinese chestnuts.
There's some debate about that. So I do know that they have found the chestnut bee on Chinese chestnut, but it was, if I recall, which I may not have the complete story, it was in an arboretum environment. In other words, all these different chestnut species, including the native ones, were in there. And so it may have just been a convenience. So like so many of these bee questions, we need more study. So we're way, we're 150 years behind the bird people, and just where are the bees, how abundant are their life history. We have, in just the 20 years I've been working on bees, named new species from Maryland. Okay, so we don't even have the names settled now for these particular species. So that's a great question. So it would be nice to look at that and figure that out, because there certainly are plenty of Chinese chestnuts lounging around in our landscapes that nobody is looking at.
Let me open it up to a real live person, and then I will go back to, there are a lot of questions in the chat, at least comments and questions. But Jim, would you like to unmute and we can take your question or comment? Jim McGlone.
Yeah, I know Sam at one point talked about forest management strategies and how they would affect bees. And when it comes to managing particularly hardwood forests, a big part of the objective is to get sunlight to the forest floor. So in listening to what you're talking about, that's going to help the bees if we can keep the invasives out. The other thing that I was thinking about in terms of your discussion of the strategy or the history of things is longleaf pine was once on at least the eastern coastal plain, a really important ecosystem with red cockaded woodpeckers. And those were really savannas. They weren't closed canopy. And there is a big push now to restore those ecosystems. If you go down to Piney Grove Preserve down near Wakefield and Waverly, they're managing for red cockaded woodpeckers, and they're using loblolly pine because that's what's there. But you get a lot of herbaceous and shrub growth in there. So those are two things. But one question I had was, you mentioned the rosacea, and I almost hesitate to ask this, but what about multiflora rose and Prunus avium, which are both non-native rose family plants? Are they supporting our native bees, or?
Yeah. So what's the last species? Prunus what?
Prunus
what is that
avium.
Common name? Is that the
bird
bird cherry?
Yes.
Yeah. So I know relatively little about bird cherry. I do know that I do know a lot about multiflora rose because it's right at my height level, and when I'm out catching bees in any kind of environment, I'm also often intersecting with multiflora rose, and I can tell you that there are bees on it, but nowhere near, for example, if I saw a swamp rose or a pasture rose, blooming, the numbers and types and amounts or blackberry bees is far, far higher. So what it is and why it is rosaceous, you would think, like, why not? I don't know the genus. What's the genus of multiflora rose? Do you know? Is it Rosa? Okay, well, the reason I bring that
It's
up is
Rosa.
pardon? So
That was
It is Rosa.
okay.
Yeah.
All right. So so that blows my other theory, perhaps, which is that it's taxonomically too far away. It still could be just that it's designed for, I think, an Asian component of bees and attractions of what they're interested in. So an interesting counterpart to that would be the genus Malus. So apples are from the genus Malus, but the apples that we use are coming largely from the Carpathians and that part of the world. But we do have the native crab, so that's also genus Malus. It doesn't look like the commercial apples are that different from in terms of attraction than the native crabs. So I'm distracted. My phone is ringing, but I'm ignoring it. And so I think it's difficult to generalize on that. It would be an interesting study to look at these open. So there's lots of different sort of, for example, ilexes. There's lots of different kinds of willows and things like that, and do the comparison between native and introduced. But in general, the further you get taxonomically from a native species, so like Buddleia, it will get honeybees, no surprise, right? Because it's from that part of the world, and not get hardly anything else, some bumblebees and things along that line. So I can't be very definitive, but I think we're seeing something similar to what Doug sees when he looks at the number of lepidopteran, so moths and butterflies, species that are occurring on native species of plants versus non-natives. He tends to not a little bit less focus on the specialized nature of that, although I believe there is quite a bit of specialization in Lepidopteran too, versus the general pattern that this just maybe my impression from hearing what other people's impressions are, that these non-native species of ornamentals and other things that we tend to plant back into our environments are just not sufficient to support our native insect groups that use those kinds of resources. So it always just goes back. Native plants are the way to go. There may be exceptions, but in general, that's the kind of thing that we should emphasize in any kind of planting plan. If your goal is to support the larger native environment, which is really what you're doing with native plants, versus I've got a particular, I want to grow a grove of Paulownia for the wood. So we'll see what happens.
okay.
Let me. Sorry, Jim.
Raise one more question that kind of ties what Doug Tolomei talks about with it. You mentioned the secondary chemicals the plants are producing to control their pollinators, the things like tannins and nicotine and things like that. And that ties in with Ptolemy because that's what's controlling what eats the plants. So it
would be similar, yeah.
So it may be that some of the rosacea, like the Malus, they're all using the same suite of secondary chemicals. So yeah, it's open to everybody, but the roses may be a little more specialized, and you may see different suites of those secondary chemicals in the bloom. So
yeah, yep.
Can I take an interesting
needs more study
question from the chat? Somebody asked if there were actually, let me find it again. Kathy asked if there were actually any ornamentals that repel bees, native bees, and she lists maybe mums or eucalyptus. Do you know of any, Sam? Plants that would deter bees?
Yeah, I don't know. So first of all, if a plant has a flower that's pretty looking, so we'll just say colorful and large, it's pretty much so it's spending a bunch of plant money to make that flower for a reason, and that reason generally is the flower is the signal to the bee community, but sometimes it's to a bat or to a beetle, but not as commonly. So in general, it's a signal to the bee community or the insect community at large. It almost always is to come and get it, right? That's how you find it. So I would say no, but nature is really tricky. So maybe there's a bee repellent. So the chemicals, though, as Jim was mentioning in there, so the the design of the secondary compounds that might be within a pollen or nectar component uh, are often very toxic to the wrong species of bees. So they'll do studies where they'll take a set of bees that are out at the same time of year, and so they let the bees nest. They'll take the pollen and nectar load from one species, and then they'll transplant it to a different nest in the same species. Everyone does fine, right? They're just swapping these pollen balls around. But then they'll take a pollen load from species A and put it in species B, and the pollen load from species B and put it in species A. Everyone dies. So whatever it is that the bees are gathering, it's highly curated. So those bee species are specifically selecting certain kinds of pollens, even though they have access to everything, right? And for a reason. And we don't know necessarily all the reasons, but whatever reason leads to death if you don't make, and that's a strong selection gradient. So if you don't make the right choices. So the general story is that the pollen and nectar of many plant species does contain chemical signatures that are somewhere between repellent and toxic or are tied closely together. But it's never absolute. It's like, I don't want any bee to ever visit me. It can't be that, or the plant don't get pollinated. It's just like, I don't want all these visitors. I just want my favorite ones.
Can relate. There's a question about living in a townhouse community and planting trees. And I know you said that you don't have a list like Keystone Species ranking order list, but this person wants to know if you have a recommendation for one best tree to plant in shade and one best tree to plant in sun to help bees.
Well, so first of all, I do have lists of good bee plants that people might think about planting. They're longer lists because there is no one. So you can email me, and if someone wants to put that in the chat, that would be great. My email address, and I will be glad to send you that list. So I can't give you that recommendation because there's so many good ones.
Okay, I will put your email in the chat for everyone. And okay. Arthur had several questions in the chat and has his hand raised, I believe. So if you would like to maybe pick your favorite question to start with, Arthur, and unmute yourself, would you like to ask Sam?
I'll ask a question that's not in the chat, okay, but it's occurred as I've listened. So I tuned into this because I've heard in the news that honeybees are in danger of extinction. Listening to you, honeybees are just one of thousands of species of bees. Are bees overall in danger of extinction? And also, if the honeybee does go extinct, do these other bees, will they be adequate substitutes for the honeybee?
Okay, great question, because this is something that I think a lot of people have thoughts about. So first of all, honeybees are not native to the Western Hemisphere. So given that, everything got pollinated before they came here. So the short answer on the honeybee question is ecologically, there's no role for honeybees in our environment. So we don't need honeybees. Culturally, there's lots of reasons. Agriculture, there's a limited set of reasons, and basically those reasons hinge around not the garden, not the small field, not the small vegetable plot, but the giant mega industrial fields where they have killed everything in those fields, and they're dealing with a thousand acre watermelon field. Well, you better bring in something because you've killed everything else. Or Central Valley of North America. So from the honeybee point of view, we as native plant or as native bee species, we're not interested. Now, in terms of the native bee stat, it's also not true that honeybees are in danger of extinction. So you can get as many honeybees as you want to this day. What's happened is there are new pathogens within that system that people were afraid were going to take out all the honeybees, but basically have just made it more expensive to have a honeybee because you have to do a lot more work to produce the next generation of honeybees successfully. But it is being done quite handily. So we don't have either a shortage or a reason right now to worry about the decline in honeybee populations. And then the natural environment is just this whole separate category which interacts with honeybees, but is largely taken care of by the native bee species groups. And additionally, the native bee species groups have an interaction with our agricultural species, not necessarily 100% complete. So the almond crop is a good example where mostly there's no native bees out when they bloom, and you have to bring in honeybees. But many of the native bee species will move into gardens and do the pollination there. And some are derived from native plants, sunflower, pumpkin, several other species, and they are chock-a-block full of native species that move in there. Native species, we have one endangered species, and it's a bumblebee species, Bombus affinis, that has not a like pesticide problem or anything. It's a disease was brought in from Europe that impacted a number of different bumblebee species, but differentially. So what we see is something that we can't control, like a disease has hammered this species. When we look at the other species, we are in the middle of assessing that, but we can at least say that we probably can find all of the other native bee species that are out there. And the reason for that is we say probably because we had some preliminary lists of like, well, maybe these are gone because we haven't seen them in several decades, and then we find them. And the answer really is, well, if you have hardly anybody looking, then you're just going to miss these things. And if you don't look at these obscure plants, like if you don't look on daughter, which nobody looks at, you'll miss the daughter bee that is specialized and only goes to daughter plants in marshes. So like I'm pretty sanguine about the situation. I think we have most of our species around. They're pretty good at colonizing. The bigger picture is other species are less able to accommodate those kinds of things. So what we want is to have an emphasis that when we make changes to the environment, which may be just passive, like if you stop doing things, sometimes that's good. Sometimes you have to go back and get rid of your invasives, that we want a little more understanding that you want, but we're not talking about like, yes, you should go back to school and get a PhD. We're talking about just bring in more native plants, bring in a set of those plants that reflects the local landscape, the original local landscape in some way. And that's 80% of a good job. So that's the basic story.
Beth asked about the rusty patch bumblebee and whether there are plants that we could use to help the rusty patch bumblebee in our area.
So the only place in Virginia and actually in the east of the central states, there's 4 central states that still have the species, and then everything else has disappeared. So we're pretty solid on the understanding that they're gone, except for the mountainous region on the West Virginia border. And so that species originally moved way into the Piedmont, was throughout all of West Virginia. We have lots and lots of lines of evidence, and it is gone. Except that in these upper elevation, highly forested areas, this species still lingers, and we're not 100% sure why it's there and not anywhere else. But it has to do basically with and it occurs up into Maryland, right on that border with West Virginia, same configuration, but is not going to Pennsylvania any longer. Apparently not even to North Carolina. And it has to do what appears to be with strong understory component, including a lot of wild hydrangea and other mountain species of plants that it uses early in the spring and is just hanging out until about May in those environments. And then it moves out because the woods have shut down into nearby stream corridor and small woodland road corridor in which people don't mow it, and transmission lines and things where some of these mid to late season plants are blooming and providing. Elsewhere, so backing up, all bumblebees are generalist species because they have to. They are out in if we're painting a large brush, from the first part of spring to the last part of fall. The species divide that area up a little bit. And so they have to use a lot of different plants. So they're pretty good at using what's available. And so Bombus affinis, that was kind of long-winded about, which I tend to do, sorry, about Bombus affinis, because it's important to know that if you're living in Richmond, you're not doing Bombus affinis work anymore, but you are supporting many other species of bumblebees in the region. So those species are largely going to be using this similar kinds of things. So larger bloom. We have some lists. We have a bumblebee. I don't have the Jared Fowler, who was working with us, did a bumblebee garden planner, and that's the one you should use. And you can put in all kinds of different kinds of design elements and get lots and lots of different kinds of lists, including what state you're in. So if you looked up Jared Fowler bumblebee garden planter, something like that, just a very simple presentation of, you put in, like, you can put in what color plants you want, whether you want shrubs or trees or those kinds of things. It'll give you ultimately a list of plants to plant for bumblebees specifically.
There is a question from Dale that I cannot pronounce. Dale, if you're still with us, asking if a specific plant is good for bees. I can try if you're not.
Mm-hmm.
Can you see the chat, Sam?
Okay.
I don't even want to try. Chemycyperus.
Chemycyperus?
Chemycyperus. And
I wasn't even close. Chemycyperus.
I mean, I think that's what it is. And I think there are some natives and some non-natives, but I have a lot of those. I think they're mostly Japanese, but I'm just wondering if those are good for bees.
So Chemycyperus is what's the common name on that?
I think like one of them is like a full cypress.
Yeah. So that's it tends to be the columnar things that we tend to put around the corners of houses, right?
Yeah.
So those are wind pollinated. So bees, are generally going to thumb their noses at that. Well, they would, because there's nothing there for them.
Yeah. Thanks.
Arthur, you still have your hand up. Do you have some other questions you'd like to ask Sam? Let me go through the chat really quick and see if I've missed anything, and if anybody does have some other last minute questions before we let Sam go. There was a question about stilt grass. I know you've mentioned trying to remove invasives. If anybody has figured out how to remove stilt grass, please let me know. It has taken over my yard.
I can give you a hint. There's some nice YouTube videos people are doing large scale removal of stiltcrafts, and what they're doing is they're coming in with you basically get a propane tank and you get these flame spreaders, and yes, you get to play with fire, and you want to get the stiltcrafts early-ish in the spring when there's still some woody last year's whatever material on there, and you burn it out. So you'll burn some of the native plants, but it's a annual, so you basically have taken care of that plant, and then the natives will recover. And because this, you'll eventually use up a lot of the seed source. So that's a possibility. You can search the YouTube universe for more information.
I like the idea of the blowtorch or playing with fire. The seed bank does stay in the soil for years, right? So you might have to do this
I don't
year
know.
after year.
I don't know the details.
I think it does.
But if it's not producing new seed, then you're on the winning direction.
Yep, I think hopefully I've hit most of the questions in the chat. Is there anybody else? Pete has his hand up. One more question from Pete for Sam before we let him go.
Yeah, thank you. That was really fascinating on the bees. I guess my question is just if you can kind of speak to the end of the season. I'm sorry, the end of summer. There's a lot of flowers out at the height of summer, and then there's kind of that lull before asters and goldenrods kind of come in the fall. Like, it seems like bee activity really goes down. I mean, I know they're still around.
Yeah.
So what are they doing then? And what plants are they finding?
So we didn't get into a lot of details, but most bee species are only out for like a 7-week window when their set of resources is available. So in the spring, there are lots of bees, and then that bee species group. So you have a 7-week window, and then within that are these different bloom periods for plants. So they need all the plant biodiversity so they can move around. And then what happens is throughout the season, you have different groups of bees coming out using sets of pollen and nectar sources from those plants that are different from in the spring, and then they disappear. So in the fall, and so the big picture is, yes, there are way fewer bees in the fall than in the spring because the volume of pollen and nectar is a lot less. You've lost, for example, the entire woody plant group has disappeared. But there are a whole set of bees that only occur in the fall. Most of them are very small and very much not the kinds of things you would pay attention to. Like there's no stinging, there's no honey, there's no anything for them. But that component from a complete let's save all bees is super important. And we tend to emphasize, not the purpose of this talk, we tend to emphasize the large species of yellow composites as a component that leaks out of these environments because they just have one mowing and they're done. And they tend to not be around as much because I think we've largely eliminated them. So moving large species, large yellow composites, allowing the asters and goldenrods all have tons of specialist bees on them, and allowing some of these fields to exist, mowing them in the winter. It's a good thing.
Can you squeeze one more quick question in?
Yes, and then I do have to go.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Sam and Trish. So I was the one who asked the question about soil disturbance. And since 70–80% of bees are ground dwellers, I'm curious about what advice you have about planting and replanting native plants when some of the bees have started to establish themselves underground.
Yeah, so I guess my short answer is don't worry about it, right? So in the world, there's life and death is going on all the time. You can't know, like one of our biggest problems, where are these things nesting? So it's very difficult to find their nests. So you can't mark nests. It's not like a lot of other things. It's like, oh, well, I'm not going to cut that tree because there's a bird nest in it. It's like you have no idea where the nests are. So in general, I wouldn't worry about it. If you were a farmer and you're doing field work and you're doing pumpkins, then maybe we would want to go with a a much more no-till kind of approach. But if you're a gardener, it's like, I'm going to dig up this plant and split it and put in new. Am I messing up my bees in that environment? Maybe, maybe not. We don't really know where they're nesting, but I wouldn't worry about it, because the kinds of things that you're doing in your garden are probably going to ultimately produce more flowers, and flowers are the limiting factor in the world today. So that's about all I can say about it. Trish, you are muted.
Fantastic. I did put Sam's email in the chat. He said he has to run, so if you have,
Yep.
he said he's welcome. You're welcome to email him. Hope that's true for further questions. I also put the link to our Green Breakfast webpage. People asked if this would be recorded. Yes, and we will share the recording on our webpage and through our email list after I edit it. So thank you very much, Sam, for spending this Saturday morning with us and for such a great talk. We really appreciate it.
You bet.
And thank you,
All right.
everyone, for joining us. And I hope everyone has a great rest of their Saturday. Thank you so much. And we'll see you in January for the next Green Breakfast.
Thank you, Trish.
Thanks, Sam.
Thanks, Jim.
Thanks,
Bye
Sam.
now.